Und herzlich willkommen. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich hier zum Talk in der Gesprächsreihe Perspektivwechsel. Ich bin Patricia Hofmann und arbeite in der Kommunikationsabteilung der Berliner Festspiele und freue mich sehr, dass dieses Gespräch zustande gekommen ist, initiiert eigentlich von Lisa Benjes mit, die Field Notes betreut. Field Notes ist eine Plattform für zeitgenössische Musik, die diesen Monat einen Monat der zeitgenössischen Musik veranstaltet. Und heute auf dem Podium haben wir einen Gast des Musikfestes, Rebecca Saunders, Komponistin, die gestern Abend eine Uraufführung hier präsentiert hat, Yes. Und von ihr waren jetzt auch 3 Stücke im Konzert gerade zu hören für Soloinstrumente. Und des Weiteren begrüße ich Ed Atkins, den Künstler, der im Martin-Gropius-Bau am 29. September eine Ausstellung eröffnen wird, eine große Einzelausstellung Old Food. Und deswegen freuen wir uns auch besonders, sozusagen das Musikfest mit dem Martin-Gropius-Bau hier gemeinsam präsentieren zu können. Old Food ist eine Ausstellung, die im Rahmen der Reihe Immersion der Berliner Festspiele stattfindet. Und ja, ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Gesprächsrunde und übergebe jetzt an Bastian Zimmermann, den Moderator. Das Gespräch wird auf Englisch stattfinden und ich bedanke mich.
Thank you. I trained it for weeks. I'm very excited to have you here, not tonight, today. We will talk today about the use of voice, language, and the spoken or sung word and text in your both artistic work. We are very happy that you're here and excited what we can talk about. First, I want to introduce you both in a little biography. Rebecca Saunders is born in 1967 in London. After an initial conservatory training as a violinist, she studied composition, first with Wolfgang Riem in Karlsruhe and later with Nigel Osborne in Edinburgh. Her work for ensembles is mainly focused on working in specialized settings of sound and musicians. While you have used the voice in earlier works, your recent focus on the female voice appears to be a new development. In 2015-16, you wrote your first piece for soprano solo and ensemble called Skin, which was premiered at the Donaueschinger Festival. This summer saw the premiere of your work for solo soprano, O, which includes passages of Molly Bloom's soliloquy from Joyce's Ulysses. And just yesterday, as Patricia mentioned, we just heard the latest premiere of the ensemble piece, Yes, which is only based on the soliloquy. Ed Atkins is born in 1982 near Oxford. He's very well known for his critical rethinking and replaying of digitality in his video installations. He earned a bachelor degree from Central St. Martin's and later graduated from the Slade School with a master's degree in fine art. He mainly works in video art and poetry and has had several solo exhibitions at the Tate Britain, MoMA, the Serpentine Gallery, MMK Frankfurt, Palais de Tokyo and Kunsthalle Zurich. In 3 weeks, there will be the opening then of Old Food at Martin Gropius-Bau. Music or musical structure plays a significant role in your video work, and you recently published a collection of your writings, a primer for cadavers. You use field recordings, sound samples, and of course your own voice. The voice is used in experimental, explorative way with mumbling, swallowing, and other vocal sounds replacing the use of text. May I ask you at first, Rebecca? Molly Bloom's soliloquy has inspired numerous works of you over the last 20 years. Can you share why that text in particular is so special to you?
Well, the first time I used one word from the text, which was yes, was in 1995, which is a long time ago. But in the meantime, since then, I hadn't actually gone back to the text. So specifically, like I did with Yes from yesterday. It took me a long time to find a way in which I could address the enormous complexity of the text, but also to find a way in which I wasn't setting the text, but integrating it into my music. trying to allow, nevertheless, the text autonomy, or still not to be touched on and not to be disturbed in any way. What really fascinated me about the monologue specifically is the way in which there are so many different strains and what I was called surfaces of ideas, which rise above this constant flow and then disappear again. And there are it's also got an extraordinary energy, which is so unrelenting. And the way in which certain ideas, passages, single words or phrases are repeated is an astonishing way in which he structures the piece. So there are certain words, not just the word yes, but oh and ah and no, a lot of no's. People always talk about the yes, but there's an enormous amount of no's in there as well. That this use of punctuation I thought was also very interesting. The way in which he enables the listener or the reader to structure, to follow the structure of the monologue. But I think the most important idea was for me was this kind of polyphony. I hear, when I read the text to myself, I hear a polyphony, a way in which different voices, ideas, perspective, characters, different emotional states are constantly being intertwined, and every now and again you get a completely different perspective. I also was fascinated by the brutality of her language, and what I've found is there are many interpretations of the text which you can see in films or in different kind of theatre productions, but what I found was missing was to address actually this certain brutality that is so present, and so there's nothing really so lovely about it, really. And I think I wanted to bring this out to the foreground also, not just the innate poetry of his language.
Yeah. May I ask you, Ed, what impact does this text, like, let's take the soliloquy of Molly Bloom, have on you? Like, did it, has it, doesn't it? Like, after reading your text, I have the feeling that Joyce has a deeper influence, like, on your writing.
Yes, although I think forever been cowed by Joyce insofar as I daren't go there or something, precisely because of a lot of what Rebecca's saying about the kind of almost the sheer insolubility of this thing. You know, the fact that it's not something that is easily in any way mediated, or, you know, the kind of, it's so vertiginous. You fall down that thing, you know, just forever. It's motile in a way that I feel like is very hard to encounter. But of course, Joyce and that soliloquy in particular, as a kind of almost virtuosic act, has a big influence on my writing. But I think particularly that point where writing starts to shrug off its kind of straightforward idea of communicating meaning, that actually it's much more about the experience of the writing, or the experience of the tenor of a voice, or of the text, or, you know, other things start to materialize, rather than you know, where the text becomes opaque. And it is a thing in itself, and that's extraordinary as an act of sort of magical thinking, I think. So that's a huge influence on me, and obviously after Joyce, you know, Joyce is a kind of watershed moment, I would think, and then there's a huge swathe of writers and people, and also people who are around the same time. And it was interesting, you know, that the piece of Rebecca's called Bite, which is from Beckett, you know, and Beckett, I guess, was probably more approachable because it concerns itself more straightforwardly with failure, or the inability to do something, or a kind of blockage, and that desire to speak but not knowing what to say, or the desire to sort of hold time and fill it with, like what I'm doing right now, you know, slowly just unraveling, and I won't be able to finish this sentence, but, you know, that's part of it, I think.
Yeah, but you got to Beckett, that's good.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Your videos are also, like, strongly based on text like you write. Can you tell more on how you compose them, or like what is writing for you?
Previously, it was very strict. Like I would write something, and that would become a video. It was just that. And latterly, it's much more that the two have sort of drifted apart again a bit. Insofar as I've gotten a lot more interested in not being able to speak, I think, in a kind of inability and a kind of retarding of language and coherence. So
works quite well still.
Yeah, no, yeah, but you know what I mean. It's like it's less. But it was never a kind of script in a video, but much more writing as a kind of an immediacy. You know, that you can, in writing, you can find a way. Making videos is a long and arduous process, whereas writing a sentence is not necessarily. So it has a kind of immediacy which is accessible as a practical thing, and I guess it's the way I think is through language first, and is not some synesthetic kind of vision or something. You know, yeah.
When we think about speaking a text or reading, like I found one quotation of both of you, which where the similarity is quite striking. Ed, you said in one interview that you want to create like an uncomfortable feeling, close feeling to the figure on the screen. That is what interests you. And Rebecca, you said one time where you got asked why you didn't write for voice for such a long time, where you answered that working with voice is too close for you. Can you respond to that? Like, what does it mean for you to work with a voice on stage? Why did it take so long?
Well, that's kind of the question I was asking myself by writing Yes, you know. And I haven't really digested it yet, so I'm not quite sure what the answer is yet. But I think the thing about the voice is its extraordinary intimacy, subjectivity, the closeness to the breath, voice being the thing that really makes you, it's so deeply personal. And I think by working with the voice, you have to be ready to let out the monster in you a little bit, I think. I think it's the way in which you can begin to maybe transcend us really saying nothing and really meaning it. I also felt it incredibly difficult to approach the voice because I don't like to actually be saying anything with my music. I want my music to be speaking for itself. I like to think that we are implying, but I don't like the idea of the arrogance almost of actually saying it's about this, let's think about this. That's one of the extraordinary things I think about Beckett and his writing, that he so successfully managed to capture an extraordinary, reduced and skeletal and deeply expressive, fragile, but simultaneously, again, the word brutal, vocabulary and language, and to really say nothing so exquisitely, you know. And that's, I mean, once you find Beckett, it's hard to leave because he's just nailed it, you know, for me anyway. And that was, for me, the biggest challenge, is how to approach the language in all its poetry, but at the same time to not actually give in to actually saying it's all about this. You know, it's not about setting a text. It's about giving the text a new framework, a new environment, a new perspective from which it can be heard and felt, I think. So I found that I just had enormous respect also for the texts, which really fascinate me. I don't feel as if I could touch them. You know, I felt it was almost sacrilege really to come too close to them. But I think the bottom line really is, I think once you start working with spoken, whispered, sung words, there's an enormous potential really just to let the monster out, really. I mean, what interests me is what's under the surface of things, you know. And I think through working with the voice, you really can let off the lid And maybe I wasn't ready to do that.
Can you refer to that monster when you working in this like when we see your like huge video installations and you have this very close feeling of your voice? It's a totally intimate, fragile situation.
I think, like Rebecca, that feeling of to go there, to speak. I mean, even just to. We were talking about this earlier, but this idea of sort of it's a characteristic of everyone that is incredibly individual and subjective, but which exists sort of that leaves you, that is some vulnerable little breath of yours leaves your body and commingles with the world, and you cannot, once it's done, there's no going back. You can't undo that sort of thing. And I think precisely that sort of vulnerability is something that I always wanted. That feeling of intimacy, and very particularly with language that is not necessarily already mediated. So it's not read from a piece of paper, but is a kind of, what's going to happen when I open my mouth and start speaking? Or what's going to happen? And that kind of that really opens a sort of possible wound. But also, it's a kind of opening that people can either reject or not. But it's definitely, it has a vulnerable thing because of its stark, naked self. It's super recognizable as you, and and there's nothing else in the way. There's no kind of mediation, I suppose.
You always give your voice to the avatars in your videos.
Yeah, but that's because because the work. It's weird. I don't really know. I've definitely tried with other people, but because the work is, or at least I hope it is, coming from a very particular. I don't mean autobiographical, but at least it has the singed edges of a kind of biography or something, or of personal something. And I feel like to double down on that by both writing the personal thing and saying it. And it is me, and there's another kind of thing shed, a barrier. Feels awful, but important, maybe, Yeah. And I think other people doing it, it's also, there are certain things I don't mind doing to myself, masochistically, that I can't do. I can't be that sadistic, I suppose. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, there's something about getting other people to do things. It's an extreme, and I think this is a big part of the voice as well, is a ventriloquism, and part of the horror. So much horror cinema or whatever is based on possession through the voice. The point in The Exorcist when the girl's voice changes is much more horrific than her appearance. Who cares? It's the fact that she's inhabited by this breath, this voice. This is precisely the monstrous. And you think of even like the oracle at Delphi or something. It's the voice of Apollo speaking through the oracle. It's like there's something about the voice that is commanding and frightening, and from somewhere deep inside or outside or whatever. Yeah.
In both of your works, like mumbling, swallowing, and all kinds of sounds produced by the mouth, beyond or beside its function. To convey language in a proper sense, does the meaning of words deviate from its musicality? Rebecca, it's a huge question. Or like, how do you see the relation of musicality and the meaning of language in
Can we open up to the audience at this point?
Yeah.
I can't answer that, actually. Try again. Yeah.
It's like in your work, there's a lot of sounds which are pre-language, kind of, which are intervened with the language, which come out, go into language and out,
I was interested in Yes, and also in the last two pieces with the soprano in it. I was interested in trying, I didn't want the soprano to be something separate from the musicians. I also made a point of the conductor also not being separate from the musicians, that all the musicians belong in one team, part of the same ensemble. That's why, for example, Einar Popper also played the bass drum and the percussion and conducted the a cappella speaking voices through the instruments and stuff. And in the same way that the soprano is very much part of the central fabric of the instruments I'm working with. So one way to try and answer your question is that, the sounds with which I was working for the soprano are also present in the orchestra, in the ensemble's individual palettes, and what I call timbral palettes that I'm working with, and that the so-called sound surfaces that I was working with for the soprano are just as crafted and reduced in the same way in which I approach work writing for the instrument. It was also important for me that the text itself became one of the threads, which part of this Gewebe, this Gewebe. Fabric, thank you. Part of the fabric of the whole thing. So working, the whole piece tries in a way to, but it's a kind of structural, it's a way of working with structure, which I've been working on for many years, is to work with this spatial and time organized polyphony, so that the way in which the monologue itself is collaged, and that these streams of thought surface and disappear throughout the monologue, is also how you experience the architectural and the acoustic space within which the piece is then presented. And in that way, I tried from many different perspectives to bring the soprano line into really deep into the fabric of the whole piece. And the same with the text itself. There is no way, like Ed so beautifully actually said, you don't actually, it's not about actually the immediate meaning of each sort of phrase that follows each other or double backs on itself or comes back again. It's about the whole thing that then transcends out of the monologue. So I didn't try and make sure everything is comprehensible all the time. In fact, I played with that. I purposely played with that to suppress the meaning of the text, but nevertheless, my interpretation of the text to be shown through this kind of complex mixture of text and musicians together. And the sounds. There are many of the sounds that she worked with. A lot of people ask me what electronic means I was using to change the voice, but there's absolutely no electronics in the piece as well. Mm-hmm. But to be working, if you were just on... These sounds are also in many of the different instrumental palettes. So that all the sounds, every single sound which comes in any part of the modules using the soprano are also explored in other instrumental palettes. So I tried from many perspectives to integrate her completely into the texture of the piece.
Yeah.
It's something fundamentally radical, it strikes me, to not privilege the voice as a kind of anthropocentric moment, or like, oh yes, we should obviously sort of treat language and ourselves, as in you're a human as well, and above and beyond, or to carry different kinds of meaning, or to have a different role than that of an instrument, say. And I think there's something sort of frightening and extraordinary about that leveling out of the playing field of like, no, this body becomes an instrument and language becomes music. And that sort of swapping and of emphasis in a way, of changing it feels almost sort of post-human as a kind of way to understand a sort of ontology of everything, there's something about a couple of the pieces today that were played. Fury particularly felt like it wasn't about whereas there were several pieces in there that wonderfully sort of channeled a very literal understanding of the voice, of a human voice. You know, that sort of world. I mean, forgive my ignorance, but then I thought there were a couple of your pieces that really rejected the idea that the instrument should somehow even relate to a straightforward human expression or something, but was its own body. It had its own sort of corporeality.
Well, that was very much about what those solos are about. I think writing a solo is probably the hardest thing we can do as a composer, or for me anyway. I think it's harder than anything in a way, because you really have to try and embody that corporality of the instrument and the physicality. I mean, you're so involved in the drama of the relationship between the performer and his instrument.
Yeah.
They've been together for years and they won't separate, you know, and that relationship has an extraordinary dynamic. And to actually you have to draw on that, and I feel that that's the basis of any solo really, is to try and create a central core of what that instrument is really about. But that's actually the way in which I began to approach voice, is actually treating an instrument like a protagonist. What is the essence of this thing, of this relationship, of this instrument, and of its sound and of its sonic potential? And that's how and that's also really how I finally managed to face voice in a way.
Right.
Its very fallibility, its very limits, the fact that they have to breathe. You know?
Yeah, damn them. Yeah.
Damn them.
Yeah.
So let's work with that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's breathe. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, it's a striking thing that it took me a long time to have protagonists in before I was making sort of exclusively computer animated things. I was using real cameras and stuff, but I found it very hard to film a person. I had the backs of heads a lot in videos, but never the face. And there was something about the face that sort of collapsed structural possibilities. You know, suddenly you had to have this thing that people would be very interested in, a real person. So part of the reason of having levels of artifice of a computer-generated thing was that you could maintain a kind of plateau of structural interest about everything, that this figure was the same as the background, was the same as the effect of lens flare or something, you know, that this kind of exquisite and sort of frightening maelstrom of everything, you know, at the same point, where you could see things in comparison properly, rather than get sort of lost in, you know, here's a beautiful person singing or something. You know what I mean? Yeah.
You also use a lot of phonetic articulation in your works, and also in the earlier works, which are more film. I remember, I'm not sure if I'm right, but there are some where it doesn't come to language. Like it's just... and...
Yeah, but that not that it's prelingual or anything. It's sort of like mid-link. It's like it denotes liveness in a way. It's like what happens when anyone is speaking without a script, is that they don't know what to say and they don't know how this sentence is going to end, but you sort of make it up as you go along. And obviously, in making a video, you can't really do that because it's a thing that's going to be pressed play, you know. So there is not live, but that sensation, which is part of that intimacy and the vulnerability of a voice, is that what the fuck is it going to say, you know? And is it going to be able to say anything of any merit? And what is the desire that powers that thing that wants to speak but doesn't know what to say? And that's almost like from outside of the vessel of the body and going, okay, here's this instrument, the body, what will I make it say? You know, and I feel like I wanted that feeling, and a lot of that, or the shortcut to some of that, is definitely engaging with a kind of you know, a world of hesitancy and worrying about what it means to actually say a statement, you know?
Has it got something to do with this border? You know, you talk...
Yeah, that cusp, anticipatory sort of... And actually it's funny actually thinking about, like, one answer to that problem of what to say is to say everything. And that's maybe the Joycean kind of, or part of that is like, right, fuck it, this is 9 million pages and it's constant and you're going to just tumble with this thing and don't look back, just keep going. And the other one is a kind of almost, and then there's the Beckettian kind of let's sort of repeat each other and try out this in order to fill time. And then there's the kind of muteness, the silence. And I think the operational silence is such a huge part of all of this, of like knowing what waiting is, or what, all of that stuff is, that's where the thrill happens. And there's a very Beckett idea as the sort of unword, the thing between the words, the gap. And if we focus on that and try and write them, what the fuck happens?
He always says unsaid. Unsaid.
Yeah. It's deep negation, but it's still extraordinary to think of, I think.
Yeah. What does the transfer or transference see of a text to a body, spoken language to a body mean to you? Like, you speak the voice of your avatars, and you compose a whole thing like around the voice to present perhaps a text. Can you talk a bit about this jump, this transference?
All right, okay. I found it fascinating, for example, one way to approach working with parts of the monologue was to make the audience very aware of how the soprano breathes. So even through incredibly quiet surfaces of sound, there's an enormous potential for tension and for holding the attention of the listener, but also for really focusing the physical gestures of the performer. So if you're talking all the time like this, and then you have to be speaking, and then you're speaking out, but then there's a pause, and you're not actually allowed to breathe again, and then you have to keep talking on the out breath. There's the possibility to open up a whole acoustic situation where you have a very, very high tension, but you're working with minimal dynamic. I thought that was very exciting. I thought it was very interesting always to be working just under the surface also of the language. So every now and again something becomes clearly comprehensible, clearly audible, and then it disappears again. And instead of just having like really loud music all the time, although there's quite a lot of loud stuff in that piece, to actually be working with very, very quiet dynamics, but still to maintain the same tension created through the loud music itself. I thought that was something very, very special and very particular to working with language. Interesting ways of drawing threads through time. But I didn't answer your question.
It's okay.
No.
It's okay.
Your turn now, come on.
What was it?
What does the body of the avatar mean to you when you do this transference of your text into your spoken
Well, it's
language?
important for me that it's not a body at all. That the thing that's missing is the body. That watching these sort of more or less realistic animations, that they never really get past the fact that they're recognizably artificial, that they're not real at all, and that there's a kind of heresy in that, to see a computer-generated person say something sort of horribly, desperately physical, or the first thing I ever made was just a sort of horrible CGI man asking you to check a mole on his shoulder, in a sort of pathetic, deeply perverse moment of like intimate language done. But I mean, that's the uncanny, right? That's, in a way, it's like, why is that thing that should be dead doing something that's frighteningly alive? And I think that there's a particular tenor to very alive things which are also banal and sort of subterranean. There's a lot of bowel movements in my stuff, I guess. but there's also a lot of substance. Everything's viscous and thick, and the language is all very, it congeals and clogs and clags in the mouth. And I think I loved the idea, and it still thrills me in a way, that sort of language, which is still just words, but to materialize words. It's almost like a sort of onomatopoeia, but of matter, you know, and have that pronounced by entirely ephemeral digital nobodies, you know, that there was something there. But I think that obviously the idea of language becoming a thing or shrugging off, like what would it be to, I mean, it's an old idea, but the idea of rather than reading text, just looking at it, and that kind of auto-retarding idea, but also what it means to maybe repeat a word, to sort of rinse out meaning from it and end up with this husk of a word that then is what, you know? And I think all of those sorts of practices are really, they're super useful because you end up with, where am I going? Where am I ending up? And you sort of end up with bodies again, and you end up with things that are sort of determinedly mortal and fallible and vulnerable, but they're also wonderful and praiseworthy. And language can often be a kind of special effect, in a way. Or words, like talking to someone is a kind of, you're supposed to see through the word and get to meaning. But what happens when you sort of block it off and make sure people are sort of stuck with the word as a... Yeah. And I think actually the musicality of language, say, is one way to find the matter of a word.
Yeah. So maybe we can... Well,
you're speaking about words in the same way as some composers think about music, that it's actually the physical, the corporality of sound itself is so much more important to have in the foreground rather than using that to give meaning to something.
Yes.
And by thinking about the issue of nothing, of reducing something to nothing, everything becomes so much more present and feelable.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that occasionally I've been sort of jealous of music in and of itself as a place or as a possibility is that potentially it can finally shrug off this fucking language and meaning making. I think what you said earlier about like I've never wanted to make a piece about anything, and likewise the thing is itself. You know, it is. It has its own kind of quiddity. It's just a. So when people say, what's it about? And you're like, well, no, watch it again. It's the thing. It's be with it, experience the thing. And I think that immanence of the thing, rather than either transcendence, where it's like, oh, it's a higher meaning, or it's like elsewhere, the outside of the work, is less interesting at a certain point, I think.
When we talk about the musicality, we can also easily then jump into talking about singing. Because, I mean, obvious in your works,
they sing. Yeah.
but also in your works. And a lot of the installations, like the avatar, or the avatars begin to sing at some point. Can you, is it the step further you were just talking about of...
Well, it's important not just that they sing, but what they sing, I think, for me. So they sing sort of karaoke, really. I mean, even if that karaoke is the Erbarme from the St. Matthew Passion or something, it's still a kind of... They sing a lot of totally wrung out songs that have been used over and over and are sort of cheapened by that. It's like a piece of music ruined in an advert for a car or something. I think that's when I get interested in a piece of music in a way. It's like when it's sort of used up and it's this deflated thing that everyone is so familiar with. So then what? What happens to this thing and how could you reclaim it? But then karaoke just generally as a sort of idea of people singing their favorite song that means the world to them and is probably attached to some vivid beautiful memory or terrible memory or whatever, and then when watching someone else karaoke, which is my favorite pastime, I think, and you see someone, if they're sufficiently drunk, really give you can see something there, and it's almost blinding. It's awkward, and I mean the worse singer the better, really, because you're seeing something unfurl there that's usually for them in the most narcissistic clinch with themselves, and that they're allowing you access to that. So the song, particularly in my stuff, is kind of engaging with song as a sort of cultural product that's used up or is used at least, and then discarded, and then someone else picks it up and puts it on and tries to turn that emotion into their own, into a vessel for their own shit, you know.
What questions do you have to singing? Like, is it like who are we singing for, or is it what is the interest in jumping from the text to the spoken language and then maybe into singing? Is there I find this a huge step in a way. Like for me, the experience always in music theater, or when also people just start to sing in karaoke. I mean, there's a convention of doing that then, but.
Well, I don't think it's not like there's a transition. I don't think it's like text to speaking to singing. I don't think there's anything linear really between them. Like you say, there's a massive jump between speaking and singing. I mean, there's obviously on different levels. We could address that issue. For example, I mean, it's a singer who's singing, so she sings, that's her training. So if she comes on the stage for 75 minutes and doesn't sing at all, that's a statement, isn't it? So do you really want that? No, I don't. Okay, so she's going to sing. But I mean, I've tried to investigate ways in which that I could try and bring those two things together, and I will work on it further, like using some jazz techniques like scat, for example. So if you're talking like that, so you want to turn, and then they have certain consonants and vowels they can use, which is also quite an exciting way of playing with the timbre and the perspective of the tone and actually making it sound deeply instrumental sometimes. So that was a nice way to try and play between the border of speaking and singing. That's quite kind of simplistic, really, in a way. It's just extraordinary. I mean, a trained singer to speak is a different voice from the singing. So it's like another character. It's like another personality. It's not just another facet. It's completely another individual in a sense. And one of the things about Molly Bloom is she is so many different characters, so many different women, but also so many different men. I mean, it's a monologue about sexuality generally. It's not just about the female sexuality. I think that's a misconception when one approaches the text, really. And there are many facets within, many perspectives within that is addressed. So in the same way, I think by her singing, by her speaking, by her shouting, or by her shouting behind her, while suppressing the voice, there are many different colours, timbres, ways of approaching the voice and addressing different, very clearly separated personalities, which are also apparent in the monologue. But she sings, and that was for me the biggest barrier, actually, was to write, a song, really. That was the hardest thing, I think.
Is there a song? Was there a song in it yesterday?
Yes, there was a song.
Good.
The beginning, like O, which is basically the basis of the soprano solo, are fragments of melody. I would say that's a song. Yeah.
Okay. Good. In your videos, like I made the experiment of putting the sound off.
Oh, yeah.
Was really interesting.
Thanks very much. That takes a long time, you know. No, I'm joking.
No, like I just realized how important the sound is in a way, like related to the space, like as a spatial experience, because you work with a lot of field recordings. Also, then this relation, like field recordings, voice very close, then sound samples of like found footage music or something. Can you tell a bit about like how you work musically? I would tell now about like, do you build up scores or?
No, and I don't really work musically. I mean, that would be a ridiculous thing to say in a way. I would say I work grammatically, probably. It's probably the structure of language and sentences and paragraphs rather than it is musical. It's definitely rhythmic. But again, I would say that that's probably slightly different, or at least only part of. It's always, the deepest pleasure for me in making any of these things is reserved for the sound stuff and the music, because that's always the pull. I remember, like, even at art college, people would sort of, you'd turn off the soundtrack to Psycho or something, and without Bernard Herrmann telling you what to feel, it's a bit boring, whatever. It's like there's no ominous, horrible tension. There's no sort of... And actually, music as a sort of emotional cue card, which you can then disabuse, is fantastic. You can sort of... And I think a lot of my stuff relies on levels of familiarity in order to escape them, I suppose. So sort of reaffirming some generic trope and then denying it its usual use or something. But I always try and record while I'm working, just me working, so just the mouse and the keyboard and me belching or whatever, and then maybe try and get that back in there somehow. But I think it's the pleasure of layering, which is very much attached to the technology as well. I'm building up compositing channels of sound and music and stuff, and tweaking certain aspects of it is... It's a level of pedantry and thrill that I really, yeah. I'm not answering anything, am I?
No,
yeah.
No,
you are.
Yeah, okay. But I like that, yeah.
Yeah. In your works, especially also yesterday and Yes, and also Skin from last year, the voice is always like deeply melted into the sound. We just spoke about also of the instruments, and it has this wavy moment. You also mentioned about the Molly Bloom text before, that it like it's kind of emerging and disappearing. How would you describe this treatment of the voice in relating to this instrument? Do you have like a...
It's the same way in which I approach the instruments in that respect, like trying to find... it's something which comes very naturally to me, and it's something I've investigated in all different kinds of ways, is how to merge one sound into another, or how to move one sound from one side of the space to the other side of the space without you actually knowing which of those 5 instruments which are participating in that transition, where it starts and where it stops, how to mutate sound, color, Klangfarbe, how to play with the transition of timbre. I find it really exciting, and it's just something I always feel impelled to do. So when I approached the voice, I just did it, because it just feels so natural to do that. And I think it's really important that the voice should disappear and melt into or abruptly fall beneath the surface of the instrumental writing. It just felt necessary to approach the voice like that. Yeah.
Okay. Can you imagine writing or like composing a piece of solo voice for an avatar?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Actually, I think it's really interesting, actually. Yeah. Sorry. No, I do think it's actually really, really interesting, because it would be playing with such a deeply disturbing contradiction. And the thing about the voice, which I found so difficult, but which I find so fascinating, which I'm just going to keep trying to work on, is the inherent, the deeply personal and disturbingly personal level with which one can be working. The very humanness, the very fallibility, the very imperfection of the thing which each of us is, and which we're all so terrified of showing and feeling, displaying and experiencing. And I think that's so cute, and as soon as you would have some avatar then, and then to really work in a very physical and very intimate way with language, I think it's actually really exciting. It's quite a disturbing contradiction. I think it could be quite exciting, the kind of formal tensions you could build out of that. It's a really cool idea.
I think that the great, in a way, so much of what's being spoken about is what happens in performance, or rather than the murmurings to your lover or something, what happens when you stage something, or you turn it into a thing that that a crowd of unknown people will see and listen to or whatever and feel.
Yeah.
And trying to sort of, it's perversely, I think that modes of alienation or like overt artifice are often the way to get back to a kind of terrifying level of intimacy. And I think it's because of what the guards that, as an audience member, one can let down in the face of a kind of apparently artificial thing and relax in a way, and then can be affronted by some frighteningly real, vulnerable something is, that push and pull between the two can be really, deeply queasy, but also, I'm not sure that it's not really far from what happens in the theatre, or even when someone is performing today, a soloist is performing today, what it is to watch someone perform. It's such a exquisitely unknowable sort of thing. What is performance? What are we doing right now? And when we interact with anyone else, I feel like unpacking that, unfurling that through the apparent safety of a sort of theatre or something is I can't finish that thought. I think.
Wait,
but I can. Yeah.
No.
Please.
Yeah.
No.
What I like, what I find interesting about what you're saying, it's this bracketing of the thing, isn't it? It's forcing something, taking it out of context, and providing a framework within you are forced to see something. It's all its nakedness, really, isn't it? Something which perhaps we consider to be so banal, but when actually acutely observed and with that attention which you are then giving it, then it becomes actually all the more,
It's also what people expect of something. The context, the form, the history, the whole kit and caboodle of something, and then doing something else with it, or breaking it, or and I don't mean it in a very trite sort of way, but just the kind of discomfort of something not happening, which you've been led to believe will happen. The points where, again, maybe this is my ignorance about certain things, but the points where certain performers would speak through their instrument, or you would hear this sort of mousy little voice appear through something, the sort of what that felt like, the sort of wavering, vulnerable glimpse of something beneath the veneer of virtuosic, learned, really terrific, incredible performance. But that sort of moment of, there they are, there's another person there. And it's sort of terrifying when you glimpse a kind of, it's like this thing that I've been obsessed with for a long time, but corpsing. It's I guess it's an English term, but it's when someone forgets their lines on stage, or they fuck up in some way, or they burst out laughing when they're not supposed to. That moment, that when something like that happens, and you're not sure as an audience member whether that's deliberate or not, it requires so much effort to sort of erect the right circumstance for that. But that's sort of all I want, And also as an audience member, when watching things of that sort of, uncertainty.
You're breaking the veneer, basically.
Yeah, but you have to establish it first, You have to be in the theatre in order to feel it break or something,
So the question the other way around, it seems like I can ask you if you would be interested that your texts are sung or performed, then...
Yeah,
you did this performance, I saw.
But I do try and read these things at things, if people will allow it,
What would happen though if somebody else were to read it?
I feel it's weird. It's a bit like someone is wearing your clothes or is in your bed or something. It's sort of weirdly like, what the fuck are you doing here? Doing this thing, which that's me, because it's too close, maybe. I don't have any distance, but maybe I should risk that more. I think I'm a coward, I think, finally, in that regard, that I can't quite risk someone else fucking it up or something. I don't mind doing it myself, but fucking it up, yeah.
Okay, I think we're about an hour now. Perhaps let's keep it there. Thank you a lot, and I want to let you know that again in 3 weeks there will be the opening on the 29th. 28th.
Oh, 28th is the opening, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And at Martin Kröpelsbau, maybe you want to say 2 sentences about what we can expect, if you know already? Like,
yeah, I do. I sort of know. It's called Old Food, and there'll be lots of. It's sort of a bit faux medieval. Lots of sandwiches, but sandwiches made of lots of sort of grim bodies and things. It's all animated. There's also we're borrowing, I'd say, like 2/3 of the Deutsche Oper's costume archive. I think it'll be sort of wonderful. I think, and horrible as well. Yeah,
okay.
Of course. Yeah. So yeah, please come. Yeah.
So thank you for being here. It was a pleasure, and
Thank you.
thank you for being here. And see you again for the next talk of Perspektivwechsel. Still not sure yet, but yeah, thank you.